Hello, hi. Good afternoon, Anthony.
Good afternoon. Can you wait?
Yeah, we can hear you. And we can also, yeah, I guess we can. No, we haven't seen your slide yet.
No, I can share my screen now if that's suitable. Okay. Do you see my screen?
Right. Yes. Yes, we can see your slide.
Okay, perfect.
Right.
So should I get started then?
Okay, I think let me just introduce you.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Hello. Assalamualaikum. Thank you for coming back and joining us in the program. So to all Lifting AI participants, so today we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Anthony Coleman from Mathys and Squire Consulting. So we will start our session now. So the title of today's this session is IP Strategy for AI Products or Solutions. So I would just introduce Dr. Anthony Coleman. So Dr. Coleman has 10 years experience in intellectual property. He has experience in the valuation of IP and intangible assets for large corporations, for M&A, licensing and restructuring purposes, and for startups, as well as SMEs seeking to attract investment for private equity and venture capital. And he has worked closely with clients throughout the UK, Europe, and the United States, as well as those from the ASEAN region in Malaysia and Thailand, particularly. He has previously worked for CPA Global, and he has experience in IP due diligence, technology landscaping, IP scouting, and IP strategy, and so on. So he also worked closely with Philips Research, and he does a lot of things on patent landscaping, aligning research, and IP filing strategies, and investigating IP acquisition of licensing targets. So with his vast experience in IP management, valuation, and strategy, I believe that Anthony is the right person to provide us with some guidance on how to best protect and manage our intellectual properties, especially for AI-driven innovations. So without further ado, I pass this to Dr. Coleman, please.
Thank you, Professor Salamat, and thank you for Rani as well for the opportunity of talking here today. Indeed, the focus of today's talk will be on protecting IP within the AI kind of businesses or the particular area. Obviously, there are some general strategies which will apply, but then there are others which are more specific to the AI and software sector, and we'll be running through those today. We have a Q&A at the end of a half an hour, so if there are any questions, there's plenty of time to discuss those at the end as well. So if I just get started, just a brief introduction to Mathys and Squire Consulting. So we were previously known as Coleman IP up until a few months ago. We're the consulting and commercialization arm of Mathys and Squire, which is a patent and trademark attorney firm. And as Professor Salamat mentioned, we work in pretty much all areas of IP from the commercialization and strategic point of view, while our colleagues at Mathys and Squire LLP are the attorneys who will deal with the legal side of it. We've already discussed my background, but as I said before, we have worked quite a lot in the UK, Thailand, Turkey, and previously also with clients in Malaysia, Vietnam, and Sri Lanka. So we do have some experience in the ASEAN region as well. So basically, to get started on the topics for today. So the idea is that initially I'll talk a little bit about why IP is important, the different types of IP for those who are not so familiar with it. And then we'll dig into the more important considerations when it comes to AI and software and what you need to be aware of. there are a few different, say, peculiarities with, say, AI and software, which you might not have with other types of intangible assets, and you need to be aware of those. And then towards the end, we'll be focusing on, for those coming from an academic background, dealing with universities in terms of trying to spin out, for example, there are a few things you need to be aware of there. And then I think finally at the end of the talk, I just want to reiterate some of the main points when it comes to developing your IP strategy. And of course, we're available for follow-up after the Q&A as well, if you have any specific questions on your own business. So just to get started, let me just move this out of the way. The first question many companies, especially at an earlier stage, will have is, why do I need to have IP at all? So what's the point of having IP and trying to protect? Because in some cases it does cost. So first of all, it's important that you protect the innovations you've made. So the investment, the capital you've invested in your own business, it's important that you do your best to protect that. And IP, especially registered IP, is one way of doing that. It's also important that you protect yourself against potential counterfeiting or passing off. And this is essentially where others try to pretend they're you. So they come up with a product similar to you and try to use a similar name, basically benefiting from your brand and your recognition. Or they just try to copy your product straightforward. So again, this can happen in pretty much any sector, including the AI and software sector. It's very important as well that IP gives you a competitive advantage over others. So by getting your IP registered and getting a strategy in place as soon as possible, so as early as possible, you're helping yourself get an advantage over others in your area, so other software companies developing AI-based products. So that's a very important thing to remember. It's also useful to think of IP as an asset in its own right. So the different types of IP are not just a way of supporting and protecting yourself. They're also assets which you can use for generating different revenues through different means. And we'll discuss those a little bit later in the presentation. And then I think finally, it's important that we recognize that it's a way of disseminating new information. So it spreads new information about new innovations in particular sectors. And it's also a way, if you monitor what's happening in your space, it's also a way of being able to generate new ideas as well and come up with new solutions. So just to go on a bit further from that, when we talk about intangible assets, which is really the way we should be looking, especially when it comes to the AI and software space, intangible assets covers a few different types of assets. So first of all, we have the intellectual property, which is the legally registerable rights, which most of you will be already familiar with. So those are the patents, the trademarks, designs, the trade secrets, albeit not registered, but they're still very recognized as enforceable rights. Then you also have copyright, which is very important in this case, and then databases, which is also very important. So actually, for many of you, the final three here will be some of the most important assets that you'll be dealing with. So in addition to that, though, we also have intellectual assets, which are the people-based assets. And these are the skills built in the team, so the founders and the main team in the business, the know-how that they've built up over time, unrecorded inventions that they may have developed over time. So as you innovate as a company and you come up with new ideas, some of those ideas for sure will go into products, others you may decide to protect as patents or trade secrets. But in any case, you will have a lot of unrecorded inventions gathered in your company. And what we generally recommend is that as an innovation company, you try to have an invention disclosure form present. And that's basically a formalized way of writing down what your new innovations are as you develop those. So when you do come along to try to develop new products, you have a record of those new innovations. When you're talking to investors, you can tell them, yes, we have patents, we have trade secrets, but we also have all of these other inventions, which might eventually become products as well, or patents. And then finally, it's the intellectual capital, which relates to your brand proposition and your reputation in the market. And again, for those in the software and AI space, especially those developing apps, so publicly facing apps, this is extremely important because anyone doing something similar to you and using a similar brand could easily damage your reputation and essentially take away your market share. So it is something you need to be very, very aware of as a company, especially in this space. So if we look a little bit more detailed on different types of IP, and I won't go into too much detail after this, but For those in the AI and software space, these are the main types of IP that you're likely to be looking at. So trade secrets are going to be very important for anyone in the AI space, largely related to the algorithms that you're using. So they generally can't be patented. So trade secrets is generally the way to go in terms of protecting those. Patents, you can get patents in the software AI space, but there are some caveats to that, and we'll talk about those later. When it comes to registered designs, these can be interesting for those, especially those with app-based products, where you might have a specific user interface, and that's basically where most likely where a registered design might come in there. Trademarks, again, this relates to your brand propositions or your brand name. If you have a specific brand name for your product or for your company that's very important and that has a lot of leverage in the market, then you should be trying to protect that. And then finally, copyright. Copyright is going to be one of the main sources of protection that you'll have. Essentially, as soon as you write some code, or if you're writing a book or composing music, as soon as you put pen to paper, or in the case of software, as you write some code, that's copyright and it's automatically protected. There are some things you can do beyond that, and we'll discuss those in the coming slides. So before we go on a bit further, just to highlight why IP is important and really stress why it's so important. This is a study that was done a couple of years ago by Ocean Tomo, and you can see that in 1975, the proportion of value, so the total value of these companies, so these are big oil and gas and basically capital heavy companies, the total portion of value related to the IP, so the intangible assets, was quite small. It was basically the patents supporting all of the work they were doing. If you fast forward to 2018, when this study was done, you can see actually it's completely flipped. So now the vast majority of value in companies these days is in their intangible assets. And for all of you listening, as if you have AI or software-based companies or products, most of the value you have will be based in your intangible assets. So it will be based on the software you develop, the algorithms, the databases for training the AI, for the databases of clients, of potentially the output from the software itself. So all of this is the intangible assets would actually contribute to the value in your business. So once we understand what IP is, then you really need to understand why you need to build an IP strategy. So it's not purely the case of, okay, I'll file a few patents, protect some trade secrets, and there we go. You really need to think of IP strategy as a way of building a plan for your business to optimize the use and revenue generation based on your intangible assets. So how are you going to use those to the maximum to gain money for and revenue for your business? When we think about developing an IP strategy, there are a couple of points we need to consider. And those are, what are your intangible assets in the business and how are they being used? Do you actually own them or not? So this is a very important question. It's important to know how they're being used in terms of, it's fine if you as a business have, for example, if you have a patent, but if it doesn't relate to the activities of the business, then it has little value, unless you're generating revenues through some other means. Ultimately, the business model and the business plan and then the IP strategy will really need to align, and we'll talk about that later. So you really need to be using those in tandem as the business grows. And then ultimately, obviously, with the IP strategy, you need to be aware of changes in the market or competition, and also using it in various ways to generate revenues for your business. So I think before we go on in terms of the IP strategy, it's also really, really important to remember that your IP strategy is not static. So it's not a case of, okay, now I'm an early stage business. I recognize the need for IP, protecting IP, and for an IP strategy. I'll do that, and then I'm set. It's not so simple. Just as a business, you would not have a business plan now and assume to have the same business plan in 5 or 10 years. Your IP strategy is the same. It shouldn't be static. It should change as you as a business change, but also as the market changes. So for example, as you grow your IP portfolio, your IP strategy will need to change. If your business model or your market approach changes, the IP strategy will need to change. Also, if your technology relevance changes. So if you have a business focused on a certain technology and that technology gradually becomes irrelevant to the market or obsolete to some extent, then you obviously need to change your business model, but also the IP supporting that business and those products will also need to change if you want to survive. And then obviously if there's certain competition in the market, that may change your approach in terms of where you file your patents, whether you decide to protect through a patent or a trade secret. So in terms of looking a little bit more deeply for developing your IP strategy, the questions that you really need to ask yourself are the following. So what intangible assets do I have in my business? And the intangible assets are the full range of assets I mentioned in that previous slide with the oval shape diagram. So to do that, you can do what we call an IP audit. We do this with a lot of our clients, which is basically going through all of the intangible assets in the business to see what you have in terms of patents, trade secrets, copyright, know-how, how it's being used, databases, the different types of databases, and going through all of those to see how they're being used, how they support the business, and how they're being protected. Once you've done that, then you really need to see, okay, are those assets registered under the business name? Because when it comes to, say, talking to investors, and especially for valuation, for example, it's important that those assets actually belong to the business, because it's more difficult to show the value that they have in the business if they don't actually belong to the business. So you really need to be transferring those assets to the business if you already haven't. It can be the case, and I've seen it with many clients, SMEs, for example, that in the early stages, they filed a patent or trademark under their own name. But now that as the business grows, they need to actually transfer it into the business. So that's something to be aware of. And then another important question for many of you today will be as well, okay, I have these different intangible assets or intellectual property. How am I using them? So you may be using it to support a product or service. So you're selling a product or service, you're generating revenues on that, and then your IP is supporting that product or service. However, it could also be the case that you're not actually using it yourself. So you have a patent that you're not using for your own products, but you're licensing it to another party, and that's creating an additional revenue stream for you. So there are different business models that many companies use, and it can be a combination of those different approaches. And we'll talk about those in a little more detail later. For your IP strategy as well, when you come down to setting your IP strategy, you also need to consider what is your business plan and what's your market. So by that, I mean, if you, for example, as a Malaysian AI company, so for example, if you have a software platform, software as a service, for example, and you have a patent supporting that, and you have a Malaysian patent, but you're actually you're doing well in Malaysia, and then you decide to expand it into the rest of ASEAN and then forward on to Europe and the US. The Malaysian patent will only protect you in Malaysia, so you really need to think about at an early stage, okay, what are my next steps in the coming 5 to 10 years? Which markets do I want to access? Because in order to access those markets, you really should have protection in those markets. So you need to think at the early stage what those markets will be and when and how I should get protection in those markets. And I've seen that many times where clients didn't really think about that, and they decide to enter a market and realize, okay, I'm generating revenues, for example, in the US, but I don't have any protection there. And that leaves me completely open to potential attack from another company in that market. So you need to be aware of what the longer term plan is. For AI companies, especially IP from third parties, so are you using any open source software? This is extremely important, and I've seen this a lot lately, where companies are using open source software. They're planning then to protect their own software, but they don't really know to what extent they're using open source. So this is something we'll talk in quite a lot more detail later in the presentation. But you need to be, if I were you, I would say one of the first things you should be doing as an AI or software company is checking, so basically auditing internally what open source software you're using, to what extent you're using it, and if you're meeting all of the copyright or license requirements. As I mentioned earlier as well, when it comes to developing your IP strategy, you need to be aware of what your competitors are doing, who they are. What are the risks to the business? So, is there a risk in entering a certain market because you have a very large competitor in that market? Is there any way of getting in without potentially infringing what they're doing? You might want to think about in some markets of joint developments with some other companies who already have a good access to a certain market or a certain demographic. And then I think a slight nuance on the IP strategy is that it should also include your filing strategy, which is relates to the patent and trademark area, because both patents and trademarks are regional rights, so they only give you rights protection in a certain region or certain countries. You need to think in the long term where you want to have protection, and also there are time limits in getting that protection. So it's not the case that you can file a Malaysian patent now for a technology and then decide to protect the same technology in, for example, in the US in 5 years' time. It doesn't work like that. So there are certain time limits you have in terms of deciding where to protect and actually engage in that protection. So again, that's something you need to be very much aware of. And when you're filing a patent or a trademark, you need to talk to the relevant attorneys in that to see what they would recommend. Then also you decide what you want to do as a business in terms of accessing certain countries. And then with that, you'd come to a combined strategy for protecting those future revenues in those countries. Sorry. So the other thing I wanted to kind of mention was that there are advantages as well for companies, especially SMEs, having an IP strategy and having IP rights. So for example, there was a study done about 2 or 3 years ago with the European Patent Office. And essentially what that did was they tried to ascertain what the benefits were for companies having IP rights and having an IP strategy. I think it's very interesting to see what the results were of this. So for those having patents, they saw that SMEs with IP rights, so in this case patents, were 20% more likely to experience growth. And then high-tech companies with European patents, in this case obviously in the European context, would have higher chances of expanding and growing. Because basically it's showing that you're a highly innovative company and you are taking measures to protect that innovation, to protect those new innovations and inventions coming from the company. So again, these are all things that you need to be aware of as SMEs, and especially in the very fast-moving AI and software space. So the main message there is, get in there fast and just keep moving. So as soon as you recognize you have an innovation, do your best to protect it and then keep it moving, because there are a lot of competitors out there. They also noticed that SMEs with trademarks, in this case European trademarks, more likely to experience growth. And again, that's because they have a very well-known name in the particular market, and they're doing the best to protect that reputation in the market. So as you develop the product, you gain traction, you gain more customers, you expand to different markets, your reputation in that market grows, and then you should really be doing your best to protect that reputation. Ultimately, it's best if you have a combination of these and some of the other rights I mentioned earlier. I think it's also important that there's a thing called freedom to operate, which is basically saying, you may have intangible assets and intellectual property, but are you free to use those in a certain jurisdiction? So, for example, are you free to use this software, this AI-based app in the United States, for example, if you want to enter that market? So this is by already having some intellectual property and especially registered in those jurisdictions, that already gives you some level of assurance that, okay, it is easier to potentially enter those markets. That said, you do need to often really look at what the competitors in those markets are actually doing and how that may impact your move into that market, because they may have software that they're using in the US market. There's maybe no patent supporting it, but it could be protected by trade secrets and copyright. And if you were to enter that market, then you may risk infringing those. So you really need to be monitoring who else is out there doing what you're doing and the moves that they're making. And I think lastly, it's interesting to see that these sort of companies also experienced high growth in terms of employees. So they expanded, they created more jobs in their local economies, and basically expanded the the business to new jurisdictions. So essentially, now that we've kind of run through the points you need to consider for an IP strategy and also what the different types of IP are, I think it's important that in the first place, you identify what your business goals are in the longer term. You understand how your IP and intangible assets can support you in doing those goals, achieving those goals. You perform an IP audit, as I mentioned. So this is something we do with a lot of our clients. Then you make sure that you align those intangible assets with the business goals. So moving forward, you put everything in a row basically to ensure that as the business grows, as you enter new markets, that the IP is supporting you the whole way along. And obviously, if anything changes, then you modify accordingly. And then, you know, the final point is to execute your IP strategy and do your best then to commercialize your IP. So try to generate revenues using your IP in as many ways as possible. And for many of you, that will be purely supporting your products and services. So to talk a little bit more detail from the AI and software side of things. So moving away from the actual IP strategy, but more to the specifics of the IP protecting your software and AI. There are a few different types that we'll talk about. So one of them is copyright. Algorithms obviously will be protected in certain ways. You may have patent protection, trade secret protection, and design protection. So with AI, there are some specifics which you don't find in other sectors and other areas. So first of all, you have the data sets used to train the AI. So who owns those? What are they? And what sort of protection do you have for those? The actual algorithms themselves, how do you protect those? The machine learning methodology, you know, if you've developed something specific yourself, you may also have protection there. The more generally speaking, software or the software application will have a level of protection as well, usually copyright. Then there's also the question about who owns the data input into the system, who owns the data coming out from the system, and then there's the bigger question of, say, the big data that's created. So imagine if you have an app which is, you know, it's a SaaS model. So users are downloading it, basically inputting the information and getting some sort of feedback back from the system. Over time, you will build bigger anonymized data from that as well. So which will tell you across a certain geographies or certain demographic, certain details, so certain insights. And that in itself is a useful asset and that should be protected as well. So just to drill down a little bit further into the training data. So in terms of ownership and IP strategy, if it's internally owned and generated, so if you're a company and you're already doing some activity and you decide to build an AI system to help you in what you're doing, then for the most part, that is yours. So the IP will be automatically assigned to you through various internal agreements. However, if, like many companies, you're taking data from outside, then the question can be slightly different. Sorry. So in that case, the question is, okay, if I'm taking data from outside, so training data from external to the company, first of all, what are the agreements, the terms of use of that of using that data? Is it updated? So is it a static set of data? And if it is static, then what's the actual usefulness of that? Because, you know, it might be quite limited in terms of actually being able to train your model properly. The other question is then if it's a licensed data, so if it's rather than just simply buying it and that's it, if you actually license it in from a third party, what are the conditions of that license? In this case, I think it's extremely important to, first of all, think the question about whether it's static or not, because again, you may, especially if you're doing multiple iterations of the AI system, so if you're tweaking that, you may also wish to be using constantly updated data sets to train the model as well. But on top of that, you need to be aware of whether you're licensing it exclusively or not, because, and this is an interesting question, because imagine if you're developing software, AI supported based software package, so for example, an app of some sort, and you're using training data coming from a third party, but under a non-exclusive license, realistically, there's nothing stopping them from going to another party and also doing the same. And if they have a similar model to yours, they may end up coming up with a very similar results and similar, essentially, product to what you're coming out with. So it is worth thinking about whether it's exclusive or non-exclusive. There are certain laws when it comes to data sets for text and data mining. So especially in the academic space or research space, you are to an extent protected. So you can use external data without risking infringement. Again, this varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So for example, in the EU, there are certain laws that protect that, but only up to a point. So you really need to check your local laws in terms of where the data is coming from. As soon as you go towards commercial use of that data, then you may risk infringement. So there's a question of, when you're using that data, are you replicating it in any way? Because if you are, then you're potentially infringing the copyright of the other party. There's also the question of, if you're using an external data set to train your AI model, and you're tagging it or labeling it in some way, this can be copyright protected in some way, but so the actual database, the structure might be copyright protected, but the actual content may be trade secret. So again, there are different considerations you need to be aware of there. And this, again, can change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So there's no simple answer there. Essentially, I would say you need to just be aware of, first of all, where the data is coming from, what are your contractual obligations in terms of that agreement that you have in place. And then if there's any stipulations on who owns what data at what point, you need to be aware of that too. So if we move more towards the actual, away from the training data and actually onto the software itself, the AI system itself, and the algorithm, there are a few ways you can potentially look at protecting yourself and your technology. And we'll go through these over the next few slides. So copyright, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the main approaches. And basically, as soon as you write the code for what you're doing, it's copyright. So that's automatic. You have protection of that copyright up to 70 years after the death of the author. So whoever wrote it 70 years after death, you still have a protection. That said, because of the difficulty in detecting infringement of software, and especially AI, you should in many cases think about registering your copyright as well. So you can do this in the US and China. There's formal processes for that. And also the World Intellectual Property Organization has recently come up with a copyright registration tool called Whiteboard Proof. And if anyone's interested, so there's a link here on the presentation, but if anyone's interested, I can send it to them afterwards as well. And basically what that does is allows you to submit a copy of your copyright material. So this could be a copy of the software, and they will basically timestamp it. So it's saying that, okay, as of this date, it's registered. And if you got into litigation with someone afterwards, then you can prove that you have copyright as of that date at least. So that is something to consider. The only thing I would say in that case is you should be removing the algorithm from that before you submit it as a registration, because obviously when you register it like this, it's made public to some extent. So you need to be careful what you're submitting, essentially. So more broadly speaking as well, when it comes to protection of AI and software and the algorithms involved, for most companies, the algorithm is protected as a trade secret. And I'll talk a little about in the next slides what a trade secret is, but it's basically a way of keeping the algorithm protected within the company without formally registering it anywhere. But there are some caveats there, so that you need to be aware of. And then patents, as you all know, is a very good way of protecting your innovation. But there again, because in the software and AI space, there are restrictions on that. So before we go into that, as I mentioned, trade secrets are a very good option for many of you in the AI space, especially when it comes to your algorithms. So the point of a trade secret is that essentially you just keep it secret in the company. You don't tell anyone. You need to take care though that you do keep it secret. So it should be as few people in the business knowing about that trade secret, or knowing about that algorithm, or exactly what it is. Because the point is, you don't really have any or very little legal comeback on it. So from the legal standpoint, the onus is on you as a business to protect it. And if it's stolen and you go to court and you say, okay, this other company stole my trade secret, then you really need to be able to show the court that you did your very best to protect it, and still it was stolen, for example, through an employee that left or something like that. So again, it's an alternative to patent, but it does carry risks. That said, I think we would advise generally for companies in this area then and using trade secrets, which is a very common approach in software area, to first of all raise the awareness of what trade secrets are within the business, so people understand that, okay, the algorithm and these other parts of the business, for example, it could be certain databases, are trade secrets. They're extremely important to the survival of the company. You can't let them out. We have a list of those who know the trade secrets, and if it gets further, if it goes out to other companies, for example, we know who the leak might be. So you just need to be very careful how you're protecting it, essentially. And of course, if they have any questions after this, I can answer them as well. As I mentioned, patents is a slightly more tricky question. So generally speaking, an algorithm or a computer program is not patentable. So you can't get a patent for that. And that's why so many companies use the copyright and trade secret approach. That said, in Europe, if your AI platform, or if your software, more generally speaking, has a technical impact or a technical output, then it might be patentable. In the US, they use a slightly different approach. They have this what's called the Alice-Mayo framework, and basically it's a two-step process based on existing case law, so existing historic cases, where they decide whether it's eligible or not. So it's a little bit more complicated, but again, in both cases, largely speaking, if what you're doing has a technical output or technical impact on something, then it is likely to be patentable to some extent. I would say, just to point out here, that in most cases, for most companies in the AI and software space, what you're likely to do is to have a combination of all of these. So basically, you'll have, if you have, let's say, an AI supported platform or app doing something which has an actual technical effect, that aspect of it, so the technical effect, could be patented. The actual algorithm behind all of that could be protected as a trade secret, and then some of the other code, the broader say software package, the app, is protected as copyright. If you have a special branding there, you may protect that as a trademark, and if you have a specific user interface, you might protect it as a design. I would say overall, generally speaking, if you can, over time try to develop a protocol within your business for protecting AI-related inventions. So have a standard approach that you use, and obviously you may deviate from this from time to time, depending on what the software is. But if you at least have a standard approach to follow, then it can help things quite a lot. Just to give you a few examples to make the point on software a little bit clearer. So, for example, the use of a neural network in heart monitoring apparatus for the purpose of identifying irregular heartbeats. This has a technical contribution, which is basically identifying irregular heartbeats. So this is patentable. The neural network in its own right, so as a separate thing in itself, without talking about what it actually does, that's not patentable. So this is where you need to be really thinking what the ultimate effect of what I'm doing is. So what's the ultimate output of my software or AI system? So what's the whole point of it, essentially? Another example is classification of digital images. So, and again, here the algorithms in themselves are not patentable, but the output, which is the classification system, is patentable. And again, I've shown a few more here. So again, different control systems, denoising systems, optimization, distribution. So all of these are patentable, but the actual say AI or software behind it is not patentable. If I go back one slide, you can see that this patent talks about the use of the neural network. So it's not talking about the neural network in itself, it's talking about the use of it to get this impact. So again, if you're looking at potentially patenting, you need to be thinking of trying to demonstrate that your AI has this sort of effect. Despite the difficulties of getting patents in this area, you can see that it has boomed over the last few years. So this is a study that was done by the EPO on AI patents back in 2018, and you can see that it's increasing quite a lot over the last few years. And I would expect that this is much higher now over the last 2 years. So it is definitely possible. It is growing, but you just need to be a bit clever on how you're wording it. If we look at an international level, you can actually see that there are quite a lot of patents in the broader space. So, for example, you can see the highest level of activity relates to machine learning, computer vision, and natural language processing, all for the telecommunications, transportation, and personal devices and medical industry. So these are the really heavy areas of patent activity over the last few years. And this is from a Whiteboard report, so the World Intellectual Property Organization report. Again, this might be something interesting for some of you to read through to see what the kind of trends are in the broader area. If we look at the patent filings and the highest, the companies with the most activity in the AI space, it's not so surprising to see who they are. So it's IBM, Microsoft, Hitachi, Fujitsu, Google, Toshiba, Samsung, NEC, NTT, and Baidu. And actually, Baidu have got a lot more over the last year or so. So you can see that it's a lot of the companies you already pretty much think of are very heavy filers in this area. So there are some very, very big active companies in this field. So this slide is basically trying to show that in conclusion for this part of the presentation, when it comes to AI or software app or whatever sort of software it is, you may ultimately have a combination of different approaches to protect it. So the patents will protect the technical innovation or the technical output, so what the actually AI does in the end. The design can protect the user interface. Copyright will broadly protect the software. Algorithms, you might use that to protect the trade secrets will protect the algorithms and potentially the ML data set as well. So that it's usually going to be a combination of these different approaches to protect. Let's check how we are in time. Just to quickly highlight a few examples here of questions that can come up when it comes to protecting AI and more generally software. So, for example, I just want to say there's a client I've worked with in the past. So it's a fitness company that have a fitness app. It's a SaaS model, so it's a software as a service model, which is increasing over the last few years, this kind of approach. They have a patent for their technology. However, they have used open source in some aspects of what they've done. And then for the rest, apart from the patent, the IP they've created, they're protecting as a copyright and trade secret. So that's all fine. That's fairly secure. The open source software created a little bit of a headache for them, but they did an audit to see how far they're using it, and they did actually realize that they could work around it if needs be. The only question for them then is, okay, the output is owned by the company, but it's the use of the output by the user is permitted under the user license. So basically the user who subscribed to use this app doesn't own the data that's output, but they are allowed to use it through the license. And again, you may have another system where you do actually allow them to own it. So that can vary depending on the agreement. If I skip to the third example, which is a pharmaceutical company, so they're using AI to basically predict new drug candidates. So this is something that's happening quite a lot, especially due to COVID. So there's quite a lot of companies doing this. The only issue there is, okay, in this case, they're licensing the use of an AI algorithm and the training set from a third party. So again, this is slightly more tricky because then the question arises, okay, who owns the data that it's generating? And actually, in their case, the training set is third party as well from another third party, so from other pharma companies. So again, they may be limited in terms of how they're allowed to use that training set to train their AI model as well. So these are all considerations. Depending on what you're doing, you need to be aware of and exactly what's allowed by license, who owns what, and ultimately, in their case as well, who owns the output data relating to the drug candidate identification. Because obviously this is essentially what their product is, what they're offering to the market. So they need to be clear that they own that as well, even though the input for all of this is from third parties. I think just the last point I wanted to mention, it's not so much AI related, but it's a small story from a client that I worked with a few years ago. So basically they were a company developing software for third parties, but they also had their own online platform doing some other areas of business. So generally speaking, that's fine. When they create software for a third party, that by contract with that third party, the software and copyright created is assigned to that third party. However, the question arose when discussing and doing the IP audit with them about internal developments. So when they're developing their own software, are they using any software, so any code which was originally developed for their clients? So you can imagine that a software developer internally might say, actually, I used this code last time for this client. This is very useful. We might be able to incorporate that into our own system to improve it in whatever way. However, they can't do that because then that would be infringing their own client's software. So this is, again, it creates a lot of problems. It's quite tricky. So what they ultimately did in this case was separate the software development teams. So they had one working on their own software and another team working on third-party software. And that at least helps try to solve the problem to some extent. So again, this is something you depending on what you're doing, you might need to be aware of as well. This slide, I think, is an extremely important one for those in the AI space, and say more broadly software. And this is the open source code and your use of it. So many companies across the world, and I'm sure many of you here, have used open source software because it speeds up development, it reduces your cost, so you can save a lot. You don't need to be basically reinventing the wheel. So it is a very good thing to do, and it helps those the larger companies that offer open source software. So many of them, including Google, for example, increases their brand loyalty, and they kind of creates an ecosystem around them because you have a lot of new developers basically reliant to some extent on this open source software from whichever company. So, to some extent, it can be good for everyone in that context. However, there are a few considerations you need to think about. Okay, so for example, initial cost, it's good, it saves you money, but what are the long-term costs? Because ultimately, when you go to protect your own software that you've developed, if you're over reliant on open source software, you may need to go back and redevelop and try to work around. Open source software, you're usually limited in terms of the support offered. Orphan software, you need to be very much aware of this. So this is basically open source, which is eventually abandoned. So it's not updated, and at some point it can become obsolete. And as a result of that, it may cause problems in your software that is based on that. I think more broadly speaking, when it comes to using your open source code, and we say this to any clients we're working with in the software space. First of all, the first thing you should be doing is doing an internal audit of your open source code that you're using, because you need to know exactly what's being used, who's using it, to what extent it's being used, and whether you're meeting the obligations. Because open source software is essentially being used through a copyright license agreement. And there are obligations with that agreement. And if you don't meet those obligations, then essentially you're infringement. You're breaking that agreement, and you could be brought to court. So what you need to do is really check what the obligations are. In some cases, that can be simply a matter of listing in your own software app somewhere, or basically displaying somewhere that you're using this, you're using the open source software from company X according to license X. So that's just something you need to be aware of, and make sure you meet those requirements. These two websites are good sources for for basically open source license information. So it gives you a list of the different open source software and the related licenses. So I would definitely recommend that you have a look at these and see, okay, from this list, what am I using? To what extent am I using it? And am I meeting the obligations as listed in, on these, the various license agreements? So that's, I would say this is a very important take-home message from the presentation, is just to look at your open source software. One of the other points as well I wanted to highlight was the ownership of IP rights. And this is kind of a summary of some of the things I mentioned earlier. But if you're developing the software, generally it's yours, so that's fine. I'm assuming you're not a software developer for a third party. And if it's being developed by a third party for you, then you need to make sure that contractually all of the IP rights are assigned to you. Because again, while this is generally the default, it isn't always the case, so you just need to be careful on that. Training data sets, already mentioned those. You need to be aware of who owns those and to what extent you're allowed to use those. And if any modifications are made by you to those data sets, you know, what's permitted, what isn't, and who owns what, if any modifications are made. User data, who owns that? Again, this can vary depending on what sort of data is being input and also on local regulations. Output data again, this can vary from depending what the data is and also how it's being used. This is also the question of the anonymized big data, say, learnings from using AI. So just to give you an example, a client working in the city monitoring kind of space, they get data from third parties, and then they basically use that to provide some information, some learnings at the wider city level on demographics. Obviously, they don't own the data that's coming from the third parties, but they do own the data. So once it's gone through their AI system and the data that's turned out, they basically do own. And the larger learnings from using that data over time in different jurisdictions and different cities and different demographics also is an additional, say, database that they can potentially monetize in the future. A last point on this I want to make is AI created innovations. You currently can't protect those by patent. So basically any invention which comes about through AI. So if an AI system manages, and this already has happened, there have been some very high profile cases on it. If an AI system has come up with a new invention, you can't protect that. At least you can't protect it by listing the AI as an inventor, because the various patent laws around the world, the various patent offices will only allow a person, so a physical person, to be the listed inventor. So in this case, what you may need to do is, okay, who is the person that designed the AI system in the first place? They may need to be the inventor, or alternatively, you might say the person behind the training list is the inventor. So it's a very big argument at the moment, and it's likely to continue for quite a while. So in terms of detecting infringement in this space, it's very difficult. As I said earlier, that's why most companies will typically go for a combination of copyright, trying to register where possible, so you have a submitted record of it. It's also important to note version control is very important when you're thinking about copyright protection, so formalized registered copyright protection, especially if you're worried about infringement. And that's basically because if you register something now, version 1, and then in 5 years' time, you bring a company to court because you think they're infringing, but they're infringing version 5, then you have very little support in court, because basically what you protected and what they're infringing are not the same thing. So you really need to make sure that they match. So this could be simply a case of updating what you're registering every time you have a new version, or at least when major changes have occurred. And then I think it's important to notice that as much as possible, you try to have as watertight license agreements, employment agreements as possible, so that it's clear who owns the IP, who owns the data in certain cases, when you're talking to external suppliers or the end user, and just to make sure that there's no room for misinterpretation there. And as I said earlier, in most cases, what companies will do is have a combination of strong agreements of different types, strong NDAs, that have copyright, trade secrets, and patents in some cases as well. I think I might try to skip through these a little bit. So just when we think about discussions with academia, so many of you may be from the academic background, it's important to think about when you're having these discussions that in many cases what will happen if it's a spin out, the university will own the IP and license it back to you. You may be required to pay maintenance costs for that portfolio, so you need to just be aware of that. You need to define who will own the new developments and whether you will have to pay for those or they will. Because again, this might not be already clear from the initial agreements. And then what are the royalties payable to the university? So, are you going to have milestone payments and lower royalties, no milestone payments and higher royalties? And is there a get out clause? So for example, as a spin out, if you get to a certain point of growth, then you want to be free of the university, then is there a clause in the agreement that allows you to do that? I think more broadly, and this doesn't just relate to university IP, this is a broader, say, licensing question. When you're licensing to any third party, and again, this is a very good way of generating revenue from your IP, you need to be clear, okay, what am I licensing? So what exactly am I licensing? This needs to be very specific. Who can I license to? So are there any restrictions coming from the university, for example, who I'm allowed to license to? What are the terms of use of that? So, if you have for example, in the AI space, you may have an AI platform which has uses in multiple sectors. You may allow use of that AI platform in a single sector to a single client. So they have an exclusive license for that application area only, whereas another client may have a license for use in another application area. So this is just something you need to be aware of when you're thinking of licensing. And then ultimately, how is the technology going to be used? Will there be follow-on research? Again, will that be included in the license or not? And what royalty model will be used? Skim through this, but this is a Lambert toolkit, which is essentially some predefined agreements, which it can be quite useful for universities. So I've left it up there if anyone's interested. I've already covered most of these points. So I think just to round off with the last few slides, I think it's important just to remember that IP doesn't just support your products or services. It's, as I said earlier, it's an asset in itself. It's a commercial tool. So it can act as a market deterrent to keep others away. It can protect your reputation in the market. So this is where the trademarking comes in. It can be used to seek investment. So I have many clients, say SMEs, when they're looking for investments, they want to show that they have an extensive IP portfolio, that they are recognizing and protecting their IP as they grow as a business. There are tax incentives in place. So in some countries, for example, in the UK, if you have revenues for your company and it's supported by IP, especially a patent, then you can get a discount on your corporation tax. And ultimately then IP can be bought, sold, licensed or mortgaged. So you can use it as any other asset really. And I think it's important to notice in that context that as well that your use of the IP can change over time. So again, this is really why you need to be changing your IP strategy as you grow as a business. So as a business in the early stages, you may have your product, which is supported by the IP, and that's fine. But if you say maybe 5 years down the line, you change direction as a business, but you still have those patents, you may decide to either keep them for defensive purposes, or you may decide to license them out to a third party who does actually want to use them for their own purposes. And that can be an additional revenue stream for you. And then ultimately you may just decide to sell them. So getting to the end of the presentation now, I just wanted to summarize basically the points from developing your IP strategy. So I think it's important that from the very beginning, you recognize what you have in terms of intangible assets. And this can be the wide range of intangibles I mentioned. A good way of doing this is the IP audit I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Once you've done that, then you really need to think about how you fit in the market. So what your market is, how you plan to access that market, what are your opportunities for not just supporting a product, but also potential licensing opportunities. As you grow then further as a company, you need to be aware of the costs as well. So am I really using the IP in all the jurisdictions that I've protected it in? If I'm not, maybe I could start licensing out to third parties. What are the risks, from entering new jurisdictions, for example? And then finally, also being aware of the wider commercialization route. So ensuring that as you develop new products, you protect it with according with IP. And then, just basically make sure that you don't ignore your IP and your IP strategy as you grow as a business. Because I've seen many companies that have done that. They kind of just forgot about their IP. They knew it was in the background, but they didn't really do much about it. And then they got into trouble later because just to give you an example, I had a client who ended up almost losing a patent. They had bad employee agreements, which meant that basically it wasn't so easy to ensure employees didn't leak IP. So just make sure everything's watertight as much as possible. And with that, that was pretty much my presentation. I just want to thank all the different parties involved for inviting me today, and yeah, basically we're open to questions now.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Coleman.
Thank you.
Okay, I would like to open this half an hour for any questions from the participants.
Hello.
Yes, please, Dr. Mathys.
Sorry, Dr. Coleman. Just now you mentioned about the trade secret. Okay, and then
Yep.
you stated trade secret is one of the strategy that innovators can choose. Let's say that during the journey in commercializing the solution, and then the entrepreneur is thinking about exit from the venture, and then they will try to find partners and so on. So how do you put values on trade secret? Because as the name says, it's a secret. So how do you negotiate the pricing and then the values with the opposite collaborators or partners that you are dealing with?
Yeah, so yeah, that's a good question. It is often difficult because obviously, when you have it registered right, it's a little bit easier. But ultimately, it really comes down to the importance of that trade secret to the business, and how it's being used in the business. So, for example, just to give you an example from when I do an IP valuation, we look at a range of different assets, including trade secrets in many cases. So we will look at the entire range of intangible assets, how they contribute to the business, and then what portion in terms of respective value, the trade secret has in the overall context of the business and the intangible assets it has. So, for example, if we saw, okay, you're an AI-based software platform, your algorithm is the most important thing you have. Without that algorithm, maybe you don't have a business. Essentially, it's very difficult to move forward. Then you would put a lot of the value in the business on the algorithm, at least in the earlier days. At some point, obviously, then your user database and your market traction becomes very important, because ultimately then a very big user database is what the potential buyer might be looking at rather than the trade secret. I think it also comes down to how easily it is to work around that, because if you have an app doing something specific and you have an algorithm behind it, if it's quite easy to work around that, or to do something basically to do something similar in a roundabout way, then it's likely to be less valuable, because a competitor might say, okay, well, fine, you have that as a trade secret, but I can just do this way and get pretty much the same result, and I don't need to infringe your trade secret at all. So I think it really comes down to how important it is to the business in terms of what your actual proposition is, and that's going to vary from case to case, because it's there's no easy answer on that. I would say as well, in any case, you just need to be very careful on how you protect it. And just to give you some examples of trade secrets, so for example, Coca-Cola, the recipe for Coca-Cola is a trade secret, very famous one. KFC, the kind of the fried chicken, the coating on that, the exact composition is a trade secret, and they've been trade secrets for a very, very long time. And how you keep it secret is basically limiting the number of people internally that know it. So, you may allow only certain levels of management to know it. Once they come into the company, they're made aware of the trade secret, and they're also made aware that, okay, you're now on the list of those aware of the trade secret, and when you leave the company, we'll be watching, because we know you're one of the only people that know the trade secret. Some places also, it's probably less relevant in the case of AI, but for some trade secrets, they also separate it out into portions so that no person will have all of the trade secrets, essentially. But I think the main point is, in a business, you need to track what the trade secrets are. So we generally recommend that companies will have a list of the trade secrets. So not the details of the trade secret, but just to say what it is. So, it could be trade secret 1, algorithm for this part of the platform. And so basically you have an idea of what it is and who knows each of those trade secrets. And at some point you might say, okay, this trade secret, actually, I don't want to keep it as a trade secret anymore. I want to change it into a patent. I want to file a patent based on this. And in many cases that is possible. I hope that answers your question to some extent.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, there's a question from one of the participants. It says, in terms of cost, how does it differ between trademark, trade secret, copyright, and patent? And this, I suppose, include not just filing, but also maintaining these IPs.
Yeah, I would say it differs a lot. So if we want to put an order of cost, the patent is the most expensive. Then I would say it's the trademark, then potentially copyright, and then potentially trade secret. But you have to think that they don't give you the same thing. So if we just compare, for example, the trade secret and patent, for example, if we compare those for a second, because often companies will use one or the other or both in parallel. And there's a view sometimes that, okay, I don't want to pay for the patent, I'll just use a trade secret instead, which is perfectly acceptable. But there is a trade-off. So a patent, on the one hand, it's expensive, but it gives you monopoly. So basically, you have to disclose what your innovation is. So if I have a great invention that's new, it's novel, it hasn't been seen before, I can patent it. I have to pay for that. So I have to pay for a patent application. It's quite expensive. It depends on a certain jurisdiction. So a US patent only covers the US, for example. But in any case, the patent allows you to maintain a monopoly for 20 years on that. So once it's granted, you have a monopoly in that market for the 20 years, or those markets. So basically, no one else can use it without your permission. And if they use, you can bring them to court, or you can demand royalties. But it's expensive. On the flip side, trade secrets are free. You don't need to pay anything for those. However, the responsibility is completely yours for protecting it. And if that trade secret is stolen, you can sue the other party for trade secret theft. And actually, that's happening a lot over the last few years, especially in the US. It's becoming a very big deal. But the onus, the responsibility is on you to show that, okay, we did everything we could to protect it as a trade secret, but somehow it's still got out. So it's kind of a choice you need to make. And I think ultimately it really depends as well on not only the costs, but also ease of detection. And this is something I kind of touched on earlier. If you have something, so for example, the reason why in many cases AI and software in general use trade secrets is because if you have a patent and someone is infringing the patent, it's quite difficult to detect in the software space. So it's very difficult for you to detect whether someone is using your idea or not, because it's not so obvious. It's not such a physical thing, unless you really dive deep into the code, and you may have written additional code there, which is kind of a tracker, so you can easily detect it if you look at the code, and that's what some people do. But apart from that, because it's difficult to detect, some people would say, okay, I'd rather just go for a trade secret and do my best to keep it secret. But again, it's a choice you need to make, and many places will use a combination of the two. So for the end effect, like I mentioned, for example, in the kind of medical industry, the end effect, they use the patent, and the actual algorithm itself is a trade secret because they can't protect that as a patent anyway. Hope that, yeah. And then for the other, the trademark is only covers the brand, and the copyright is automatic. You can protect it formally and like via registered rights in a few places, but generally it's just a free automatic right.
And you mentioned just now about copyright, and then you mentioned about registering. If you want to like use it in the US, can you explain the difference, about filing the copyright and then registering at certain places?
Yeah, so basically copyright in most countries around the world, copyright is an automatic right. So, for example, as I'm writing notes now in my notebook, that's copyright. For any of you working in academia, for example, in your labs, writing in your lab notebooks, that's copyright. As soon as you create it, it's copyright. If you're writing a song or a poem or a story, it's copyright. If as you're beginning to write code, it's copyright. And you get automatic protection on that. So it's yours from the moment you create it. The only problem is when you try to enter into litigation for copyright theft. And if it's a case of a book or music, then it might be easier to prove that that someone copied you, because it's unlikely that they would come up with exactly the same thing. But the only problem is when it comes to software, if you end up going to court to show that they stole your copyright, it can be quite difficult to prove that you had it before them. And that's why in the US, there's also because it's more litigious in the US than it is in some other parts of the world. As a result of that, there is a requirement that if you do want to litigate on the copyright, that you have it registered, formally registered there. I'm not sure of the costs because I don't know many people that have done that, to be honest. Most people will just use the automatic copyright protection that's available in most countries. But it is important to note that if you do register it that way, basically you have a timestamp. And essentially the main thing that all of these different copyright registration systems are offering is a timestamp to say, as of this date, this copyright is publicly registered. So if anyone after this point tries to, if they do infringe and are brought to court, I can demonstrate to the court that I've already registered at this point. So anything after that basically is infringement, unless it's under license. So that's the reason they do it. But again,
Right.
in most cases, you don't need to.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions from the participants if you want to ask directly?
I saw a question on the chat. If we build a
Yeah.
system for a company, if we build a system for company A, well, first of all, I would say having joint ownership of a patent is already a tricky situation you should try to avoid if at all possible, because unless it's very, very clear contractually who owns what. I would say if we go back a step, if you're entering into an agreement, say joint development agreement with a party, both parties need to define what's called the background IP. So which IP is company A bringing, which IP is company B bringing into the conversation. Then once you've done that, the foreground IP, which is basically the IP that happens afterwards, so after you start talking and working together, then you need to define as well who owns that and to what extent, and who has license to use it and to what extent. If you decide to file a patent together on a certain system, then you can file that jointly, and that's fine. But then you can't file the same patent again unless it was in a jurisdiction. Yeah, generally speaking, I would say you can't really, if I understand the kind of question properly, you can't really do that. Like, basically, if you had company A filing, company A and B filing a patent together, for example, in Malaysia, and then you decided that you wanted to also protect the same innovation in Vietnam, for example, then you can file within a certain time restriction. You can file the same patent in Vietnam. So basically extend your protection to Vietnam. But you can't. Company A can't file a patent and company B file the same patent, or patent for the same thing. That isn't allowed, because basically the initial patent from company A would stop the other patent from company B coming through. If they're for different things, then yes, sure, but you need to be clear on who owned what and who did what. It's a little bit of a roundabout answer,
Right.
but
Right, thank you. Okay, I open to other questions if there is any. What about protecting database? I think, well, probably for me, this is the first time I heard about you can actually protect the database that you use to train your AI model, for example. So how do you do that? Which type of IP do you register this?
so generally speaking, it's a kind of a tricky one. So generally speaking, the database itself is copyright, but the actual content may be trade secret, or it could be copyright from someone else. So to give you an example, it's not so much from the AI space, but it could be applied in the AI space as well. So if you imagine a database that you've created, a database of images, for example, which again could be used in the AI space. Those images coming from elsewhere on the internet. The database itself that you've created is your creative work, so it's your copyright. The images themselves, so the content of the database, if it's coming from you as well, that's also your copyright, so that's fine. Or maybe your trade secrets, depending on what it is. But if it's coming from the internet, so just a broad range of images, for example, for training, coming from the internet, those are not your copyright. Those images belong as the copyright of many others. So you need to be sure that while the database is yours, the contents may not be. So you need to be sure that you're free to use it.
I think it makes sense, because sometimes some of the data are very difficult to get, like biodiversity data in one part of Malaysian forest or something like that. So this needs to be protected. Means this is owned by, because sometimes it takes a lot of money and effort to obtain this database. Yeah, but this is really good, because I've never realized that you can actually protect a database as your own.
Well, yeah, and actually, like we from the valuation side, not quite the same sort of databases, but we do. So, for example, we do work with companies which have databases of clients, and that's a valuable asset. So, for many of those, if they were to be bought by another company, that's one of the assets that the other company would be interested in buying, because obviously, if you have a business, I want to buy your clients as well. I want to be able to service the same clients. So we would always look at, okay, how recent is that database? Are the contents all yours or not? Depending what sort of database is. If it's a 20-year-old database, then it's likely to be of little value. Whereas if it's been constantly upgraded, then it's more important and more valuable.
Yes. Any more questions from the participants?
Hello.
Yes. Okay. Please, Dr. Zamri.
Hi, I'm Zamri. Okay. I would like to ask. I would like to follow up question again with the Dr. Jais asked earlier about how to protect the trade secret when we're working on the same company. I heard there is a non-competing agreement. This is how you protect your company from, let's say, there is one of your key player resign from your company, and then you try to avoid this employee take some of your businesses. So before he left, he need to sign a non-competing agreement. Do you encounter? Could you share some of the cases happening for like this?
Yeah, so I would say that that happens quite a lot in terms of, and I wouldn't say even just from trade secrets. It's often the case that if you do move to a competitor, you do need to be basically stop your employee from working with the competition up to a certain point anyway. So, for example, if you work for a company in an AI space, for they're developing some specific AI or software, then you usually they'll have a non-competing clause for a coming 6 to 12 months.
Right. Okay. Sorry, there's some background sound. Yeah, we're all under lockdown, so sorry for that.
No, don't worry. I know the feeling. It's a pity that you're gone back into lockdown again.
I know. Yeah. Any other questions? Dr. Coleman, you mentioned just now about the automatic copyright, like when you publish in a journal, for example. I think most of us are academicians here.
Yeah.
So you have something new and you publish in journals and a lot of people have access to it. Then you patent that, for example. I mean, do you need to actually do the, registering for copyright or patent when you have this copyright in place, sort of?
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually, and that it touches on two really important issues. So for as an academic, and coming from from being in academia for quite a long time myself, there are pressures on academics through their various grants to publish in scientific journals.
Yeah.
And often you may be required to do so many per year. I think it's the first case. So the first thing you need to be aware of when you create, writing in your journal or whatever, like your actual lab notebook, that's your copyright. When you publish it in a publication, so in a scientific publication, in many cases you're assigning copyright for that particular work over to the journal. So, which is that's pretty standard. But I think the more important question that you brought up, actually, or that I think the issue that you brought up, is the timing of writing in an academic journal and patenting. And this is extremely important. So I'm not sure if I mentioned it earlier, but it's a very, very important issue, because remember, when you go to patents, so protect something by patent, you're basically disclosing it to the world through a granted patent, and you gain a monopoly on that. But you can only get the patent if it's not already known to the world. So if you've already so for example, if you have a technology, I don't know, let's say developing some sort of new engine, okay? And if you have a publication, so you decide to publish in a scientific journal, big international journal, about your new engine type, you do that, and then you decide, okay, now I want to file a patent. Unfortunately, you won't be allowed to file a patent because you've already publicly disclosed that innovation. So what you really need to do then, as an academic thinking about patenting and publishing, is basically saying, okay, if I do want to patent this, I need to patent it first. So submit my patent application first. Once that's been submitted, it is kind of a stake in the ground. Then a few months afterwards, you can think about publishing in an academic journal. But don't do it the other way around, because if you do it the other way around, so if you publish first and then patent, unless they're significantly different, you're going to kill your chances of getting the patent. So
right, yeah. I think, that is the dilemma that a lot of us are facing. So we have to wait for a while. If you think it has commercial value, then patent it first. Then you can publish if you want.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay.
You can do it quite quickly afterwards. So once you've put the application in, you can quickly.
Do you have to wait for the patent to be granted, or you can just file first?
Usually, you can once it's an application, a published application, then it's generally fine. It really depends on what you're, because the issue is that it's slightly complicated, but the issue is that when you file a patent, you have there's a period in which you can take it back, essentially, if you change your mind.
Yep.
But you need to be careful that, okay, if you're sure you wanted to go to patent and you say, yes, I'll file a patent, put the application in, and then a few weeks later, you can already get started on the publication. But that assumes you don't want to take the patent back, basically, that you don't want to rescind it. But yeah, generally that's the approach that most places will take.
Right.
And I would say, just in that context, just talk to your commercialization officers to see what sort of process the university has for that.
And of course, generally, the cost of not only for fighting for IPs, but also although we know all the benefits of owning intellectual property rights, most of us cannot afford to, if there is any infringement on the IPs, it's not something that very cheap. That is very cheap.
No, that's very true. So, and that's why I think many SMEs that I know and that I've worked with, they'll either, if they file a patent, they'll either. Well, basically, I'd say the general advice is only file the patent if you can afford to do so. So that's fairly sensible. If you can't afford to do so, just keep it as trade secret and as copyright until you can afford to do so. The other thing as well, for any of you in spin-outs or smaller SMEs that may be looking for investment, try to align your investment rounds with the various patent rounds. So, for example, usually when you file a patent, you have a year then to roughly a year before you might want to take it to another level. So, for example, an international application, and then you've there's certain, say, milestones along the process in which you need to pay. So if you try to align those with your funding rounds or your grants or whatever it might be, then it makes it easier to get through those different potential stumbling blocks.
Okay, I think we'll take one more question from the participant. Anybody would like to ask?
Yes, one question from me. Thank you, Dr. Coleman. In the case of our inventors and innovators in Malaysia, let's say that we are talking to those outside Malaysia. So what will be the best protection when we start discussing and negotiating with those outside Malaysia? Is the non-disclosure agreement is sufficient, or is there any other option that we can consider?
I would say if you're just discussing, so having, say, commercial discussions, and generally the non-disclosure agreement is the best place to start. Obviously, if you start looking into allowing access to your technology, then you might want to provide a limited user license, or some sort of license allowing a limited use of your technology, or investigation of your technology. But in any case, I would definitely start with the NDA and then go from there, because the rest really depends on what sort of negotiations you're having. Because obviously you don't want to give away too much too early. But sorry, anything you should be, any conversations you're having about your technology or about even your business proposition should be under NDA for sure. And then when it comes to the specifics, then that really, it's on a case-by-case basis, I would say, because in any case you shouldn't really give them free access to your software. Because ultimately then they could just, because if you do that under NDA, then in most cases you're protected, because obviously they're not allowed to disclose it or use it to an extent.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Anthony Coleman, for sharing with us your knowledge and experience. I personally have learned a lot from this session. There are probably a lot of like sharing sessions on IP and IP strategies, but specifically on AI, I think it's quite rare. So I'm very happy that we learn something new from you, and hopefully we will meet again and have the opportunities to invite you again in other occasions. Thank you very much to Dr. Anthony Coleman, and thank you very much to Purani from the British High Com for linking us, and to all the participants, thank you for your attention. We will see all the participants again next Friday on the 11th of June for day 3 of the training in AI product development and marketing. So nice to see you all here. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Can we just take a photo for a while? If the participants can turn on their videos and we can have like a photo taking session. Right. Sahila, can you, are you ready? Or Neni?
Please unshare the slide, please.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Can get everyone to turn on their videos. That would be great. Okay, let us know, Neni.
All right. Okay, smile. 1, 2, 3. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is it done, Neni?
Yeah, it's done. Oh, one more time.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Get ready. 1, 2, 3. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And if anyone has any questions, you can send them my email as well.
Right. Thank you very much.
Great.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.